Okay, so I'm going to pick up more or less where I left off last week, but I want to, in advance of doing that, I want to sort of give you an idea of what I'm planning to do today. I don't generally do summaries in advance of doing teaching because, quite honestly, I never know what's going to happen. I mean, I usually have some notes, but often I end up speaking about something else or getting to where I want to go in a different kind of way. But this time I want to give you some sort of an overview because we're going to go on kind of a complicated trip. So I want to start where I left off and go back to this quote from Geshe Sonam Rinchen and talk about the nature of bondage. But where I want to end up is I want to talk about how we practice as non-monastics. Because, you know, pretty much everything that we read about in Tibetan Buddhism is oriented, at least in its original presentation, to a monastic audience, nuns and monks. And certainly when you kind of engage with this material on renunciation, you really see that very directly that that's the case. But that's not who we are. You know, we're lay people who are trying to adopt and adapt this practice that's been given to us by these great masters, these wonderful teachers, and make it work in our lives without being monastic. And that presents some interesting complexity. And so that's where I want to end up. And in fact, where I am going to end up, if I can get there, is to talk about life as art, living life as an artistic expression, because that's what has occurred to me as kind of a solution to this fundamental problem. But along the way, I'm going to take a detour to China, and we're going to talk about Zen, of all things, in this class. But it's relevant, and not just relevant because we have so many friends who practice Zen, and we have so many Buddhist compatriots who are Zen Buddhist practitioners, who may in fact be wondering what the heck we're doing as Tibetan practitioners, just as many Tibetan practitioners wonder what the Zen students are doing. So I'm going to loop through that and try and pull all these different pieces together. And that's why I wanted to give you an overview, because the trip we're going to go on is going to look maybe a little surprising in some respects. So to go back to the beginning, this is more or less where I left off last time, but with a little bit of review. So I gave you the I gave you the principal aspects of the path text to take a look at. And the seventh stanza of that, whoops, wrong glasses. I need my reading glasses. There we go. Seventh stanza. And this is Tsongkhapa's view of our situation as human beings, that we're swept away by the strong currents of the four great rivers, which are things like ignorance and desire. He goes into what those four currents are. I'm not going to. Bound by the tight bonds of actions which are hard to escape, that's our karma. Ensnared in the iron meshes of conceptions of self, that's the fundamental ignorance that drives everything. Beings are shrouded in thick darkness of ignorance. So, I mean, what he describes as the human condition is pretty grim. I mean, in a dark night, it's like being in a dark night in an iron cage, swept along in a river, sort of covered with tar, if you will. No one to help us, pretty miserable. Now, he uses this example as a way of describing others from the point of view of developing bodhicitta. But really, it's the condition of all of us. if you get right down to it. And that's pretty tough sounding description. But you know, it's not far from true. I mean, there are times when it really feels like that way to me, you know, when I'm kind of caught in the snare of the karma that I've created for myself that I can't get myself out of, and I'm in a state of complete confusion and depression and whatnot. And I've been in that place a lot. And it feels like there's no escape. Well, fortunately, there is an escape. And that's what the three principal aspects of the path are about. And I'm going to go back now to a description from Gen Sonam Rinchen about sort of the mechanics of how he got into this situation on a moment by moment basis. And then I'm going to switch to The Essence of Tibetan Buddhism by Lama Yeshe, because he gets very specific about what we can do about the situation, even though we're not monks, even though we don't have great powers of concentration, even though we can't really retreat from the world in which we live, and we can't practice perhaps the deepest renunciation that the monks are trying to practice, you know, but he gives a very concrete formula for what we can do to alleviate the problem that we're having. And so that's where we're going to lead. That's where we're going to lead to. So back to this passage. Part of these are notes from a lecture that Gen Sonam Rinchen did at some point. And so that's a little bit choppy. It doesn't flow. It's not literally his words. It's the notes that Ruth Sonam took and transcribed. He says, as long as we have a contaminated body and mind, which result from the actions underlain by the disturbing emotions, we're in cyclic existence. That's samsara, right? Contaminated body and mind, that means we have all the impurities that are created by our past negative deeds. And actually, it's all the impurities created by some of our past positive deeds, which is a little harder to understand. But karma is karma in one form or another, whether we're talking about chains of iron or chains of gold. Disturbing emotions stimulate compulsive actions, giving rise to rebirth with a contaminated body and mind. So our negative states of mind, driven by negative emotions, disturbing emotions, create the karma that creates more negative circumstances for ourselves. Then he gets a little bit more specific, and here he's opening up into the 12 links of dependent origination. Ignorance causes craving, which provokes action and leads to further rebirth of the same kind, and so on. The process continues interminably, life after life. The fetters and contaminated action and disturbing emotions keep us bound to the cycle of involuntary birth and death. What is bound? This is important. Our mental consciousness, which continues from one life to the next. At present, we lack control over our destiny because we are driven by these emotions whose dictates we obey. So in my own language, what he's saying is we have this awareness, it's called the mental consciousness, which is technically the sixth sense, S-I-X-T-H, the sixth sense. You know, we have the five material senses, and then we have the mental sense, our minds. So we have this mental consciousness. That's what's listening to me now. That's what you identify as me, because you place onto the mental consciousness this idea of I. You impute onto the mental consciousness this idea of I, right? But if you were to separate the idea of I, which is a little bit fictional, although I'm not going to go into that right now, if you were to separate this consciousness, this sense of I from the mental consciousness, what would be left is a mere clear awareness, right? And all experience is presented to this mere, clear awareness. Okay. In its deepest sense is called the clear light mind. But this awareness has levels of subtlety and grossness. And I talked about that in some of my talks about Tantra. But in its essence, it's the same thing, right? The essence of what you are is your awareness, your consciousness. This is the Buddhist view. The essence of what you are is not your I. I don't mean this I mean your sense of I, right? Even though that's there, that's not the essence, because that ends with this life. And what progresses from life to life is the mental consciousness, the subtlest form of the mental consciousness. That's what takes rebirth. That's the essence of what we are. That's the good news, right? Because in its nature, it's pure, it's clear, it's knowledgeable, it's the source of all understanding, it's the source of all happiness, of all bliss. It's described as being bliss void. But we don't experience it because we're so wrapped up in our thoughts, our emotions, the mental world, and we're captivated by the effects of karma, which drive us forward. Okay. So that's the situation that we're in. So what to do about it? Okay. Now let me do a screen share here. And this will take a moment because I neglected to prep for this. So hold on while I find this. Shouldn't take long. Here we go. Okay. Okay. I think you can all see this. From page 5 of Lama Yeshe's book, The Essence of Tibetan Buddhism. My two extreme minds, desire, the overestimated view and grabbing, and hatred, the underestimated view and rejecting, conflict. They're in conflict, destroying my own peace, happiness, and loving kindness. And in order to balance those two, I have to actualize the equilibrium. So this is something to remember here, and I'll stop screen sharing. Overestimation, which is desire for things. Underestimation is rejecting things. Those are the two extremities that the mind go to. Okay, so this is actually the source of what gets us into a mess. Because, as Genso Rinchen was saying, we're driven by these disturbing emotions, which create grasping, which create negative karma. But how do the disturbing emotions work? What's actually going on? Actually, there's a cognitive process that's going on. And the way the cognitive process works is that we don't see objects, we don't see things for what they actually are. And we know that they're ultimately in their actual nature, they're empty of all of our projections. But we live in the relative world, right? Especially as lay people, and especially when we're not meditating, we live in a relative world versus the ultimate reality of things. And in the relative world, how we relate to objects, how we relate to other people, how we relate to our own internal environment is understood to be fundamentally distorted all the time, right? Because we don't see things for what they are. Based upon our past karma, what we do is we either overestimate the nature or value of things, or we underestimate the nature of that or value of things. And if we overestimate the nature or value of things, that's when we have grasping desire. And that sets the wheel of samsara in motion because we're grasping after things, right? The other possibility is we underestimate the value of things, and that's a little bit harder to understand. we don't see them for what they're actually worth. We see them as being less than what they're actually worth. And so that being the case, we reject them. And this is actually the source of anger and all those kinds of negative emotions. And let me try and give an example of what this means from the experience of a friend of mine. And try and get some sort of notion of over and underestimation with some clarity, because it's somewhat of a difficult concept in the abstract. But if you spend some time doing what Lama Yeshe says, which is checking up, which is to say watching what's going on in your experience closely, or doing essentially an analytic meditation, even though he called it checking up, you can see the truth of how this works. So let me give you the example. It's a little bit homey. I hope it works. I had a friend who had a whole series of jobs in her life. She was a very competent lady, but for one reason or another, she never really held on to jobs for a long time. And so the jobs that she had were often not really very satisfactory from the point of view of her skills, didn't pay her well, didn't give her any security. And at one point she had an opportunity to get a job as a administrative staff person at the university that I was working at. And she said, it's my dream job. This is great. Regular hours, steady income, health insurance. I'm going to be around all these nice university people. This is the job of my dreams. This is going to be great. Okay. Overestimation, right? Because of what she wanted, she projected into the imagined situation more than was actually there. When she got the job, she started discovering what all the problems were going to be in working in that situation. So I see Mary Camille smiling. She knows from experience, right? She discovered that all those nice university people weren't always so nice, that a lot of the faculty had monstrously inflated egos and were a pain in the neck to have to work with. I was on the faculty, but of course I didn't have a monstrously inflated ego. And the other thing that she discovered was that a lot of the staff that she had to work with, the other administrative types that she had to work with, had figured out how to do the least amount of work possible and take the maximum number of breaks possible. And they'd go outside and smoke cigarettes and gossip and whatnot. And she was kind of the go-getter. And so what happened? Well, she immediately ran into conflict with her fellow staff people because she was making them look bad, because she was really trying to get stuff done. And they were lifers in the institution. They wanted to do as little as possible. And actually, they didn't think anybody much cared. And because the standards for production were sort of low because of institutional experience, they were right. So she was creating problems for them and for herself as a result. And then she was running into issues with all these nice faculty members who were a pain in the butt, to put it mildly. Okay. So then what did you start feeling? Oh, this is horrible. This sucks. This job is really, I don't, God almighty, this is really hard to deal with. And she basically pushed herself out of the job as a result of that. Now, the problem is, at that point, she was underestimating the value of the situation. She had this fantasy idea, a concept of a, quote, job, rather than the reality of what was going to be going on. She thought it was going to be this wonderful, great thing before she got into it. She got into it and discovered it wasn't this wonderful, great thing. And then she got really frustrated and angry. So she flipped from overestimating the value of the job to underestimating. Because actually, if she just relaxed and tried to come to terms with the reality of the situation, and accepted it and flowed with it a little bit, she would have been okay. I mean, she could have relaxed. She wouldn't have taken cigarette breaks because she wasn't a cigarette smoker, but she could have gone outside and walked around the campus a little bit and then come back, and everything would have been fine. She could have kept the job, kept the health insurance, kept the regular paycheck. This is an example of often what happens in our lives, as far as, Buddhists are concerned, that we have a concept about something and we're either driven toward it, we grasp after it, but we don't really even know what it is. We still grasp after it, and then things don't work out, and then we're unhappy. Because what we're thinking it's going to be and what it actually is are two different things, because we're not really in reality, to be honest. Or the flip side, we engage with something and we think this isn't good enough, and so then we reject it. Well, it probably was good enough. Maybe it wasn't great, but it was probably good enough, so we didn't really need to reject it if we had just been kind of looser with it. So much for my English. Okay, if we'd been more relaxed with it, or as the Lamas say, if we hadn't been attached. If we hadn't been attached to what we thought was going on, the problems wouldn't have occurred. So the problem is overestimation and underestimation. It's actually a cognitive problem. And that's the important thing. Because in the Buddha Dharma, the source of all problems is our mind. And it's cognitive problems that create difficulties for us. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we can do something about cognitive problems because they're mental. We can watch what's going on in our minds and we can practice. So practice doesn't mean just sitting on the cushion and meditating, right? Practice means paying attention to what's going on a minute by minute basis. And to the extent that we're able to, make some sort of decisions about what we're going to do in relationship to our experience. Am I inflating the value of something or somebody? Probably, or deflating it, we can watch, right? And so there's freedom in that. Okay, now let me go back to the screen share because I want to share a long quote from the book, because essentially Lama Yeshe starts talking about this, and he gives a very specific approach to what can be done. Okay, so here we are on page 57 from The Essence of Tibetan Buddhism. And I'm going to read this for people who prefer to listen or for whatever reason can't see the screen real clearly. And then I'll comment on it. Now, here he's talking to a bunch of people who, for those of you who don't recall this or were not in an earlier talk, I'm not lecturing, I hope. He was filling in for His Holiness at some gathering when His Holiness got sick. And apparently one morning he was having people do a watch your breath type of meditation. And then afterwards, he made some comments about what they could be doing or what they should be doing. He says, so contemplate your breath without expecting good things to happen or bad things to happen. See, here he's really saying let's avoid over and underestimation. Anyway, at that time, it's too late to be concerned whether good or bad things are going to happen. Whatever comes, comes. Whatever doesn't come, doesn't come. At the moment, you can't do anything about it. In other words, that's your karma. You're caught in your karma. So contemplate your breath. Now, when you reach the point where maybe there are neither good thoughts nor bad thoughts, just medium, it means you're successful. At that time, according to your level, just let go. Relax, don't be attached. Let go. Have no expectations of what's happening, what's going to happen, what's really happening. No expectations. Let go. In other words, just passively notice what's happening in your mind without being concerned about, oh, this is a good thought, this is a bad thought, I feel good, I feel bad, whatever the case may be. Just notice things and let them go by. When distractions come, perhaps your ego imagines, oh, I'm getting pleasure. Don't reject them. Contemplate such notions. In other words, don't even get distracted by, I'm feeling pretty good, which is a difficult distraction to avoid, actually, when it happens. In that way, you can reach the point where the first notion disappears, which shows that the appearances your ego imagines are false. In other words, you've inflated things, and now you just let the idea go, and it goes, which means it wasn't as big a deal as you thought it was. When they are clear, contemplate the result in clarity. Now, this is really important. This is why I bolded this. What he means by contemplate the result in clarity is you notice your subjective mind, your subjective awareness, which is what's doing the experiencing. So instead of being caught by the thoughts and being distracted by the thoughts, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent, as the thoughts come up, you just let them go. And when that happens, you can settle into your pure subjectivity of awareness. That's what he's telling people to do. That's the meditation technique. And that clarity is the actual clear, luminous nature of your own mind, of your own consciousness, of your own mental consciousness. It's there all the time, but we're not usually noticing it because we're so caught up in the display of thoughts, feelings, objects, whatnot. He goes on. If you are unable to contemplate that clarity, move your mind a little by thinking, I have just caught my ego muddying my mind with illusions and overestimated conceptions. So many living beings suffer from such conceptions and are unable to catch them as I can, and generate much compassion or bodhicitta. You can also generate the determination to release other sentient beings from that ignorance while being aware that at the moment, I don't have the ability to really lead other sentient beings into clarity. Therefore, I need to clear up my own mind more. This is a practice of altruism, right? Bodhicitta. Then go back to contemplating your own thought again. Through your own experience, you know that your mind or thought or consciousness has no color or form. Its nature is like a clean, clear mirror that reflects any phenomenon. This is a really important metaphor, right? Your awareness is clear, clean, unpolluted by what occurs to it. It simply reflects it. So think about this image. If you go into, in the morning, when you get up and you go into the bathroom to wash your face or brush your teeth or whatever you do first, you look in the mirror and it's like, oh my God, what a mess. I've got bedhead, and oh, there's a pimple there and yuck, whatever the case may be. And your breath is bad too, Well, you're seeing all that in the mirror, right? But from the first place, it's not real. In the second place, it has no impact on the mirror at all. Because you could waltz into the bathroom looking like a movie star, it's the same mirror doing the same thing. It wouldn't make any difference, whatever, right? The mirror merely reflects whatever is presented to it. So what he's saying is your consciousness is like that mirror. I mean, it doesn't have any form. It doesn't have any shape or color or anything like that. It's very hard to find from that point of view. And what it does is it reflects whatever is around. So actually, when you're looking at something or thinking about something, what's happening in that moment is the mirror of your consciousness is holding the image or the thought or the sound in that space. But you have the ability to separate the two if you choose to, right? So when the overinflated ideas come up and you're starting to grasp after something, if you want to, and this is true renunciation, right? If you want to, you can look at what your mind is doing and notice that you're having this desire, you're having this thought, this attraction, and you can ask yourself, how real is it? Is this thing going to do what I really think it's going to do? Is this person going to be what I really think they're going to be? Is this situation going to be what I think it's going to be? Probably any of the answer to all those questions is who the heck knows? So the best thing to do is just wait and see what happens. And this is what Lama Yeshe is saying in regards to looking at your own mind. But it can be what you do on a day-by-day, moment-by-moment basis, right? So this is a way of practicing without being a monk, without being a nun. So then he goes on. He says, its nature is like a clean, clear mirror that reflects any phenomenon. That is your mind, your consciousness, your thought. The essence of thought is perfect clarity. The movement of thought creates conflict, but when you investigate the nature of the subject, the awareness, you find that the essential character of thought, even bad thought, is still perfect clarity. It's clean, clear like a mirror, and reflects even irritating objects. Therefore, when even bad thoughts come, don't get upset, don't cry, don't criticize yourself. Instead, use the technique of simply being aware. Just contemplate the clarity of the subject, your own mind. If you do that, it will again become clear, because clarity is its nature. Similarly, when good thoughts come, instead of getting busily distracted by the object, again, contemplate the clarity of the subject, your own mind. This is what cuts through the karma, right? You don't have to do deep analysis of shunyata. I mean, that's nice. Ultimately, that would solve the problem. But just on a moment-by-moment basis, what he's saying, whether you're meditating or walking down the street or hanging out with friends or eating dinner or cooking dinner, and I could say a lot more about that, all your experience is held in the reflection of your mind. And you can separate the two, and you can sort of rest, recline, withdraw back into the clarity of your own mind. And the thoughts pass. They come back again. They pass again. They come back again. You let them pass again. This is the technique. This is what he's describing. Okay, let me stop screen sharing now. And before I go on, are there any questions about what I've had to say? Because let me clear them up if there are. And if they're not, that's fine too. But you can, if you do have a question, just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. No questions. Okay, that's fine. I want to come back to this metaphor of the mirror. And there are two things that are going on in this practice that are worth considering, right? One is there's an active aspect to it, which is part of a decision that you're making if you do this practice, to not be caught by your thoughts, right? It's like, I'm not going to be caught by this thought. I'm not going to be caught by this emotion. When I have a desire, when I have anger, or when I'm rejecting something, I'm going to look closely at what's going on here. And I might decide that that's just fine. The Lamas aren't saying that you stop wanting things or having things. At one point, Lama Yeshe says it's impossible. Monks and nuns also have stomachs. They have to eat, right? They can't withdraw from the world 100%. That's not the deal. The thing is, or the deal is, that you look at what the experience is, and to the extent it's possible, you decide whether or not you're going to engage or not engage. Now, when you're meditating, you just let all the thoughts going. But if you're checking up, as Lama Yeshe says, or doing an analytic meditation, or paying attention to the way your mind is overestimating and you're attracted to things, or underestimating and you're rejecting things, you have a choice at that point. And one choice that you can have is to say, I'm not going to do it. All right, that's renunciation. Or you can say, I am going to do it, but I'm not attached because I know what it really is. Well, that's also renunciation. See, that's the interesting thing. Renunciation isn't like not having or giving up everything. Renunciation is not being attached. Lama Yeshe is very specific about this. Genso Namrinchen is very specific about this. Renunciation is non-attachment. It's not asceticism. And so that's important for us as lay practitioners to know that, right? It's okay to eat the chocolate cake. But when the second serving of chocolate cake shows up, you might want to ask yourself, is it really going to make me feel better? And you might decide, no, I know it's not. Or you might decide, no, it will. Or you might decide, no, it's not going to make me feel better, but I'm going to eat it anyway, right? But then it doesn't matter because you know what's going on and you're not being driven unconsciously and being compelled to do something, but you're being free to accept, reject, whatever the case may be, because you're aware of the reality. Yeah, I know that chocolate cake is great, the first piece. And I know that the second piece of chocolate cake is going to make me sick. That's okay. I want the second piece of chocolate cake. I know I'm going to get sick. I know that's the consequence, but it's worth it because I want the second piece of chocolate cake. Okay. Well, that's freedom to get sick, but it's still freedom. Okay. So this is the point that they're making. So that what's being renounced here, right? This is the first principal aspect of the path. What's being renounced is attachment, unconscious compulsive action. That's what's being renounced. Okay? All right. Now, let me do a screen share again, and we're going to go to 7th century China. And I'll explain why we're going to go to 7th century China in just a moment. All right. Here's a poem. So let me do two things. First, let me read the first stanza of the poem. Our body is a Bodhi tree, and our mind a mirror bright. Carefully we wipe them hour by hour, and let no dust alight. Okay. This is the gradual path. This is the long rim path. Okay. Clean up the negative karma. Right? Purify yourself. Here's another poem. There is no Bodhi tree nor stand of a mirror bright. Since all is void, where can the dust alight? No place for dust to alight because everything is ultimately empty. Okay, let me stop screen sharing for a moment. I've been told not to leave the text up for too long. So let me tell you what's happening and where these two poems come from. And then I'll explain why they're relevant to what we've been talking about, that this is not just a bizarre excursion. The way the story goes is in the 7th century, an ignorant young woodcutter hears someone reciting the Diamond Sutra in his little village. And he realizes, wow, this is important. there's something great wisdom in this. He is said to be illiterate in the Zen tradition, and that's important. He's said to be illiterate. So he asks the person, what is this thing that you've been reciting? Maybe this person's sitting in an inn somewhere, who knows? What is this that you've been reciting? This person says Diamond Sutra. And where did you learn this? You know, how can I learn more about this? He said, oh, I learned this at the 6th Zen Patriarch's Monastery. Excuse me, the 5th Zen Patriarch's Monastery. So this young man, whose name is Huineng, decides to go to the monastery. So he trudges from wherever the heck he is in the south of China to this monastery in the north of China. And he gets admission. I won't go into all the story about what's going on, all kinds of interesting things in the story, most of which are completely made up. There's probably little, if any, truth at all to the story of what happens to the 6th patriarch, Huineng, in this monastery, but it makes for good reading because it's all metaphoric and instructional. Therefore, it's all true. It just didn't happen to happen, but that doesn't make it any less true. It's absolutely true. That's a metaphor, as a story. Anyway, the 5th patriarch's getting old. So he decides that he's going to pass on the symbols of the patriarchy of the Zen lineage to somebody. And who's the most worthy person? So he decides that this is how he's going to figure it out. He gets all the monks together in an assembly, including, by the way, Huineng, who's not a monk, who was sort of laboring in the kitchen, smashing rice, as a matter of fact, separating the rice from the husk. That's another metaphor, by the way. Won't go into that right now. Gets everybody in the monastery together, and he says, okay, I want to designate my successor here, who's going to be the lineage holder of this tradition. And the way I'm going to do that is I want everybody to think about what their practice is and what their experience is, and I want them to summarize it in a poem. How Zen. And show me the poem. And whoever shows me a poem that shows they have the greatest realization will be my successor. Okay. Now in a Zen monastery, there's somebody called the head student, which is theoretically the most advanced person in the monastery, other than the master, the teacher. The first poem that we saw is actually by the head student. Because what he does is he's sort of not sure that his understanding is very good. So in the middle of the night, he gets up and he goes into a corridor where there's a blank wall, which is actually going to have some paintings put on it the next few days. And he writes a poem, which displays his understanding. And his thinking, apparently, according to the story, is, well, if the master says it's good, I'll claim it as my own. And if the master says this is ridiculous, I'm not going to say I wrote it. I mean, you're not taking any chances. I mean, you know, in China, nobody wants to lose face, right? So that would be the situation. Okay, so back to the poem. All right, let me go back to screen sharing here. Our body is the Bodhi tree, okay, and our mind a mirror bright. So now we know what mirror is, because Lama Yeshe has told us, right? Our mind is like a mirror, right? Our mind is a mirror bright. So this is what the Zen students understood too. The body is the Bodhi tree. Okay, we're made up of mind and body. Mind sort of is supported by body in a way, which maybe is fictional, but I won't go into that. Carefully, we wipe them hour by hour. In other words, when the thoughts come up, whether they're negative thoughts or positive thoughts, we just let them go. That's wiping the mirror, keeping it clean. That was the technique that Lama Yeshe was telling us about. See, Zen, Lama Yeshe, they're not necessarily a big difference. That's probably heretical. Okay, maybe you don't want to pretend, maybe you want to pretend you didn't hear me say that. Okay, let no dust alight. All right, don't allow the thoughts or the disturbing emotions, to use Gil Sonam Rinpoche's language, Don't let it carry you away, right? Don't let the dust alight on your mind and obscure your mind, because that's our problem, right? That our luminous, clear mind is obscured by our misunderstandings and by our karmic impulses. Let no dust alight. This is the gradual path. This is the path of Lama. This is the path of accumulating merit. Okay, so everyone's in a hubbub the next morning in the monastery, and they think, wow, this is really great. This is a great poem, right? And the master comes out and says, okay, this is pretty good, right? So everybody should come along and offer incense to this poem because it's so good. And so now the head student thinks he's doing pretty well. Hui Ning, being illiterate, right, here's all this hubbub, and he says, what's going on? And someone tells him, he said, well, will you take me to see the poem? And the guy, another monk, says, okay, I'll take you to see the poem. He said, would you read it to me? And he says, yeah, okay, that's good. And then Hui Ning says, would you write this poem for me? Because he can't write. There is no Bodhi tree. That means there is no body. Nor stand of a mirror bright. Again, there is no body. Since all is void, everything is shunyata. Now he's taking the view of ultimate reality. Where can the dust alight? So from the point of view of the ultimate nature of mind, if you reside in or sort of step back into the ultimate nature of mind, which is what Lama Yeshe was also talking about, if you do this, right, the dust can't alight. You're in the reality of your true nature in those moments. Okay, now the way the story goes is that the master, the fifth patriarch, sees this poem and he says, okay. Somehow he knows that Hui Ning is the author of this. And he has someone cover up the poem so that others in the monastery can't read it. Then he has Hui Ning come to his quarters that night and says, yep, you've got it. You're the one. You're the successor. You know the true nature of things. Okay. So what's going on here? What these two poems describe is the distinction that in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is called the difference between cause vehicles and effect vehicles. So let me take a short divergent into this. A cause vehicle is you accumulate the merit and you accumulate the actions which produce Buddhahood. You accumulate the causes of enlightenment. An effect vehicle is a practice whereby you recognize that you already have the potential to be a Buddha, that you have the essence of the Buddha nature within you now, and you use that as the basis for your practice. All of Tantra, all of Vajrayana, all the visualization exercises that are done in Tibetan Buddhism are effect vehicle practices, because the Buddha nature within you is what you see in the form of the bodhisattva that you visualize yourself as being. And then you rehearse the fact that you are that bodhisattva. Cause vehicles would be accumulating the merit by doing good deeds, by reciting sutras, and by meditating to clear your mind of obscurations, of overestimation and underestimation. All those kinds of practices are cause vehicle practices. Okay, this is the way the Tibetans describe it. But here, what we're seeing is the first stanza is describing cause vehicle. The second stanza is describing effect vehicle. The second stanza is straight out of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, which, by the way, will be what I'm talking about next month in March, the Heart Sutra, Perfection of Wisdom vehicle, Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Okay. Huineng saying, look, you're already essentially a Buddha. You just need to know that and hang out in that space and everything will work out. This appears in Tibet in the form of Dzogchen, by the way. Okay. Now, if you really think deeply and clearly about this, you'll realize that you can't actually practice one without the other. That when you're sitting and meditating, right, and you're doing this kind of practice that Lama Yeshe talks about, on the one hand, you're practicing a causal vehicle. Excuse me. Because you're wiping the mirror clear. Whenever the overestimated thought comes up, you just let it go. Whenever the underestimated feeling comes up, you just let it go. And you reside back in the clarity of mind. Okay. That letting it go is the practice of causal vehicle Buddhism. Residing in the clarity of mind is the practice of effect vehicle Buddhism. You can't really do one without the other. And that's the point. You can't do one without the other. Okay. So this entirety of this distinction is summarized in these two poems, which is why I like it. Plus, I just love the story of Huineng and the Fifth Patriarch's Monastery. There are all kinds of other features which are very nifty, but I won't go into it. Okay, now, earlier today, Nick Rebush, who has been a Lama Yeshe Lama Zopa student from the very beginning, right, was teaching a class on clear light nature of the mind. And the description of the class is what I have here. Lama Zopa Rinpoche said, there exists a state of mind completely free of gross and subtle ignorance, the impressions of delusion. This is the pure, clear light nature of mind, and its attainment is enlightenment, the state of Buddhahood. This is the mirror-like mind. Why have we not experienced enlightenment yet? Because our pure nature of mind has always been obscured by the pollution of ignorance. The potentially pure mind obscured by ignorance is like a mirror covered with slime. The mirror can be cleaned because it is not inextricably mixed with the slime. Similarly, the mind can be purified of ignorance because the two are not inseparable. I'll repeat that. The two are not inseparable. And just as there are many ways to clear a mirror, yet all involve removal of the slime, so too are there many ways to reach enlightenment, but all require eradication of ignorance. Not only the minds of humans, but those of all sentient beings contain this potential purity that is not one with the ignorance that obscures it. However, it is only when the impermanent obscurations have been completely removed can that being be said to be enlightened. All right. So here he's combining causal vehicle practice, effect vehicle practice, but he's emphasizing causal vehicle practice. Just as the Fifth Patriarch had Huineng's poem covered up, for most people, the way to practice is to think about practice in the context of causal vehicle practice. I'm purifying my mind. I'm clearing my mind. I'm not being caught by the obscurations of my mind. But as Lama Yeshe was teaching, ultimately, when you're doing that, you have the opportunity to reside in the actual nature of your mind, which is pure freedom, pure happiness. It's there all the time. You can sort of settle back into it at any time. In fact, if you think about, okay, now I'm an impure being and now I practice and now I become a Buddha, right? And the way this is described is in Tibetan Buddhism, cause, path, or ground, path, and result, or fruit, right? I'm an impure being. Now I'm practicing on the path. Now I will become a Buddha, result. In fact, on a moment-by-moment basis, you can always be a Buddha because you're already essentially a Buddha. You just don't know it. Okay? That's what the Heart Sutra teaches. You're essentially already a free being, but you allow yourself to be chained up. You allow yourself to be in that cage in the river. Okay? Because of the karma. But moment by moment, in just instances, little instances, you can be completely free. And then you'll get caught again. Then you can be completely free. And then you get caught again. I mean, that's our condition as human beings. But that's also the way to practice in everyday life, okay? Which is to, as Lama Yeshe says, constantly be checking up on what's going on and making decisions about letting it go, being unattached or not. And of course, a lot of times we fail. I mean, I'm making it sound like, oh, it's so easy. You know, I have this compulsion, I see that it's a compulsion, and I'm not going to be driven by it. It's like, I know that that second piece of chocolate cake is going to make me sick, and I'm going to eat it anyway, right? Okay, we're going to eat the second piece of chocolate cake really frequently, but there are times when we're going to decide not to. Okay, so I'm being repetitive, but that's where our freedom is, in moment by moment. It's there if we choose it. Okay. So now, when I said that's the way we practice as lay people, okay, I also said that ultimately, I think of the way lay people practice is turning life into art. So what do I mean by turning life into art? Okay. Well, in the Buddhist tradition, usually, especially in the Gaelic tradition, they don't talk too much about the clear light mind having characteristics. Okay, it's bliss voidness. That's pretty much all they say about it, right? It's bliss voidness. But the thing is, it's not merely bliss voidness, because what comes out of it is wisdom, compassion, and creativity. I mean, have you wondered why it is you have the capacity to know the truth of things? Where does that come from? It obviously doesn't come from your ordinary daily mind, right? Now you can practice, you can study Madhyamaka. You can learn about emptiness, and you can apply your rational understanding of emptiness to your experience of all phenomena. I mean, that's recommended. That's what we all do if we're serious in this practice. That's what I've been doing ever since I studied with Genso Rinchen, whatever it was, 50 years ago or something, right? I can't even remember how many years ago. But anyway, a long time ago. Be that as it may, that's all intellectual. At a certain point, you take the step into direct experience. And when you take the step into direct experience of emptiness, that's called being on the path of seeing, what's happening? Well, the innate wise nature of the clear light mind knows the truth of what's happening. And when that mind is expressed in experience, knowing the truth of what's real, the other thing that comes out of it is compassion, because it sees clearly the true interconnectedness of all of us, our true brotherhood, sisterhood, right? On the deepest level. And compassion naturally arises out of that. So this is a new way to be in this world, to recognize this. But the third thing that comes out of that, and which is often not described, is creativity. Where do all the novel expressions of understanding come from, right? They don't come from ordinary reality. They come from a source deep within us. They come out of the mind that knows everything, which is the clear light mind. And that mind can be mobilized moment by moment, sometimes, in the way in which we practice and live in the world. And when that happens, in my experience, when that happens, we have the opportunity to turn our life in the world into an artistic expression. We can make the world more beautiful by what we do in it. We can see the world as being more beautiful, as being more coherent, as being more meaningful. I mean, art isn't just, two-dimensional flat art on a wall. Here I'm talking about art in the broadest sense of art as a type of being in the world, right? Cooking is great art. Cooking which nourishes other people is great art. Even if the pancakes don't always turn out perfectly. When the intention is good, it's still great art. Fortunately, today the pancakes turned out well, but it's still great art, okay? So every moment we can be artists of our lives in this world. We can choose that. Right? From my point of view, that's the path of being a lay Buddhist practitioner. Not a monk, not a nun, right? But being a different kind of renunciate who's practicing non-attachment to compulsive ideas and emotions. And in that practice, making life into art. Anyhow, that's what I try to do. That's my view of things. Okay. So that's what I have to say for the evening. All right. Comments, responses, questions? If nothing, I'll drink my tea and then we can say goodnight to each other.
Thank you for this. You do a beautiful job synthesizing ideas across time and nature well, and especially, just you express the ideas in a very accessible manner. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Mary. And it's nice to see you again.